interestingly, Alex was involved in master planning when fourth year did master planning as a project. They basically looked at master planning the whole university campus about 3 years ago. And Alex was interested to get involved in that. And our students predicted 2/3 of the good ideas that Fielden and Bradley Clegg came up with eventually. So it's quite interesting that when you crawl across a problem, you come up with solutions. And you're so close to the problem, particularly replanning the master plan of the university, that you actually know what the issues are. So that was really interesting, and Alex was very, very involved in that and very, very interested to see what our students produced. Okay, so I shall now rattle through this. Well, yeah, so if you haven't found the chart, it's outside there. Sign up on your way out. That's where we are. Lecture 4, Design Management. Next week's our role in the construction industry. So, like we said last week, there's this magic triangle of quality, cost, and time. So that quality is to do with what is the facility, to what standard. Cost is what are the budget constraints. And time is obviously when it's to be completed, but in order to work that out, you've got to work backwards. When does it need to be on site? When do I need to get it in for planning permission? So design management is all to do with those three things. So the first one, you've heard Alex talk about defining the brief for this facility. But even with the simplest job, say a one-off house for a couple, from the work you've looked at in the mags, you know that a one-off house can either be really straightforward, virtually DIY, cheap and cheerful, or it can be something that Norman Foster has designed on the headland, on the Cornwall coast, or something. So between those two, you need to have a conversation, and somehow you need to define what you mean by the standards. And this is where your skills in looking at precedents, digging out examples from the past, and then having a conversation with your client will come in really handy, because obviously by looking at examples you can A, say yes, that's close to what we want, but B, maybe that's going to be beyond your means financially. Operational issues can be really important, so that if you are designing some sort of a factory, there's that, Zaha did, car factory, isn't there, where the process of how the cars moved through the building really was instrumental in how the building was designed. And then procurement. We'll come on to this in future lectures, but at the university here at Liverpool, really once the architects have completed some sketch schemes, they immediately involve a contractor. And the contractor starts to say, right, well, I wouldn't do it this, or I'd make it out of steel frame, or I'd use concrete. And they then start to have an impact on how the design is moving forward. Now, the opposite of that is many of you have visited the Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester. Beautiful building by Muma. That was a traditional project. Those guys designed absolutely everything to the last nut and bolt, and then they sent it out, and they just got a builder to build it. The two extremes, you know, really show how much difference it could make to the way a design goes. And then there's the cost. So you're both going to say it's not going to cost more than 20 million, but you're also going to say, and these are our limits. You're going to discuss how, throughout the design process, you're going to check how the cost is coming along. So you're doing a little sketch to start with, and it's costing, say, about 10 million. Then you start doing much more detail, and the cost consultant says, ooh, that looks more like 12. Then you get to the stage you would be at your final submission, your design review, and then the cost consultant can really see what's going on and say, oh gosh, it looks like it's 15 million now. And agreeing at what point you're going to do those snapshots of what people think it's costing, so that the client can make a decision about how to move forward, that all needs to be agreed at the outset. And then budget review stages, I've talked about those in the wrong order. So budget review stages is the thing I've just described. Budget control method, there's different ways of working out or guesstimating what the building's going to cost, and we'll come on to those in a minute. So then we've got time. It's obvious that you've got a deadline for completion. That might not be the same date as occupation. If you're involved in the retail world, one contractor tends to do the big shell or the shed, and then another contractor comes to put in all the fixtures and fittings and stuff like that. So you need to think about that. You need to think about any interim stages. So if there's got to be approval at various points from the client or from the planning authority or something, you need to flag those up. And then you might need to consider risks. So what happens if we don't do this? What happens if we find really poor ground? What happens if all the tenders come back high? How do we get back on programme? So at its simplest form, and that's just a very, very simple hand-drawn programme for a £500,000 house, but you can see how it works. You've got the initial, what do we want? You've got the next little bit, which is a sketch scheme. You've got the next bit, which is really where you guys tend to go to with your design reviews. That's as far as you go. Then if it was real life, you'd have to go out for planning permission. Then you start doing the technical stuff, all the nuts and bolts. Then you go out to tender. If this is traditional, then it starts getting built. And the little red triangles are client meetings. The little blue triangles are design team meetings. And the little green squares are contractor meetings. And you can see how that all pans out. Now, that's something that would have been produced really early on to say to the client, best will in the world, from you phoning us up saying, I want to do my house, to you living in that house, it's got to be 2 years. And you go, 2 years? That's ridiculous, absolutely barking. Well, actually, here's my little chart, have a look, and you could talk them through it methodically. Now, they might say, well, we're not having 2 years, we want it to be 18 months. You say, okay, well, tell you what, while it's going through its planning consideration period, we'll just carry on with the technical drawings. But it's at your risk, because we can't guarantee it's going to get planning, so we can save a bit of time there. We could negotiate with the contractor, we could save a bit of time there, but all of these are risk items then, and it's the client who's taking the risk, but at least you can have a conversation. Okay, so we've touched on this before, so I'm not going to labour it. There's 7 key work stages, and sadly for you, this is important for the exam. So it's used for the basis of organising the design process. It's something that's recognised across the industry. So it's not just something that architects know about, everybody else knows about, including Alex. If you're sensible, you have sign-off at the end of each stage, so you don't have that problem you have in reviews where people, oh, I don't like this, and you say, well, last time I showed it, you loved it, etc. We also share it with the rest of the building industry, so contractors also are familiar with this system. And it recently got updated to take account of hybrid procurement systems, which we'll come on to. So those are the stages. First bit is what do you want to wish for. Second bit is what's the brief. Second bit is sketch scheme. Third bit is develop design, which is what you guys do when you're doing design projects here in BA. Next stage is technical design, which is what the 4th year have just done. All the nuts and bolts, how the structure works, what the cladding's made of. Next stage is getting it built. Next stage is handing it over to the client, finishing it off, and finally there's a new stage called in use, which I'll explain in a minute. So that's like post-occupancy reviews. That is what the RIBA plan of work looks like. And I'm not expecting you to be able to study it there, but if you're really, really bored sometime, and you've got nothing else to do, you might want to spend just 10 minutes looking at it. It's very easy to understand. It's plain English. The tasks here are interesting, and the stages there are clear. You know what those mean. And if you want to be a real smart ass, then you can go on the website, and there's actually an interactive tool that allows you to click on these different bits and it explains how things work. Now, I'm not suggesting all of you do this. I'm only saying it's actually quite interesting and it will explain to you some of the stuff I'm talking about today. And so the reason it's changed is, do you remember I told you that the university here employ a contractor here at Concept Design? Well, in the old days, we always employed a contractor there. And there used to be a little stage there, tender. But you can't do that anymore. So there's these great splurgy bits which show, depending on your approach, depends on where procurement takes place. Why doesn't that want to move? Hey. Okay, first bit is what do we want to wish for? So obviously the client, before you arrive on the scene, needs to decide how much money have they got, can they justify it, and the university have to make departments, even us as architecture, we're having to justify our business case at the moment for the money that's going to build the extension. You're going to consider a strategic brief. So we've spent the last 12 months in architecture discussing all the business about how we do reviews, how people work in studios, what sort of seminars they need, where they need to go at lunchtime for a meeting, group working, etc., etc. We've been doing all of that stuff. And then we can define the core project requirements, which are definitely all determined. They're not necessarily in the public domain, but we have now a document which summarizes all the things that architecture needs. So now we've got stage one, where we're going beyond that and discussing a little bit more detail what the brief is. So the first was aspirational. Now we're really saying we need 12 studios, we need 3 meeting rooms, we need 2 lecture theatres, etc. We're going to get better site information, and of course the area where the extension's probably going to go has got trees on it at the moment. We need to check, is it okay knocking those trees down, etc., etc. And you may well at that stage undertake a feasibility study, and we're just about to invite these 4 or 5 firms of architects to put forward design ideas. Concept design. So one of those 5 will get appointed. One of the people that you have been instrumental in choosing will be appointed. They will then produce concept designs. Now I don't really have to labour that. You know what this is. It's those initial sketch schemes that you do and allow you to justify how you got to your final scheme. But in real life, you have to tie in the cost of these things. So all the while you're developing these sketches, you have this cost consultant chappie who's looking over your shoulder and saying, well, that will work, that won't work. Sometimes issues to do with the local authority planners and whether you can get this through approval are really important. So some of the crazy schemes that sometimes arrive in BA3, very much encouraged by your tutors, and we are a place of learning, so that's just fine. There's no consideration what Camden Council might think of a 10-storey thing stuck right in the middle of a conservation area next to a market. Nobody talks about that. But in real life, that would be a big deal, and you would spend a lot of time consulting. Because if it's not viable, what's the point in carrying on with these sketch schemes? Now you're on develop design, which is the bit you really do know about, and you actually, many of you are really good at this. The only thing you tend not to be able to do so much. You get a bit of input from a structural engineer. You don't get quite the input from a services engineer you might do, so the sustainability side isn't quite as it could be. And you aren't really battling with procurement or cost issues at the moment. Sorry, at the end of stage 3, so those pin-ups that you do beautifully at the end of this semester, those are pretty much good enough to submit for planning approval. You're showing the plan, the section, the elevations, the materiality, the colour, how it sits in its setting. That would almost be enough information to submit a planning application. And that's what happens at the end of RIBA stage 3. So now we get into the technical stuff, which you touch on sometimes in BA, but not that much. Clearly, there's a massive amount of work here. The team will normally grow a bit in the office because there's loads of people doing all sorts of things. There's a lot of coordination going on between you, the structural and the services engineer to make sure everything actually works. If sustainability is a big deal, that'll have a big bearing on how the building is actually working. And at this point, you may well get input from specialist contractors and suppliers. And again, some of you have already battled with some of this. I know some of you have been looking at innovative systems of using, say, masonry to span long distances. You'd be involving specialists to do that. You prepare a detailed specification. You look at your procurement approach, because depending on if you're going traditional, like the Whitworth Art Gallery, or whether you're going design-build, where the contractor is very much in the driving seat, like the university here, will make a difference to how much you involve the supply chain and the contractor in bringing all these details together. Because if the contractor is taking responsibility for everything, they will have a big say on what you specify. You'll have to agree with them. So there's like a three-way thing going on between you, the contractor, and the client. And finally, you've obviously got the health and safety issues to be worrying about. So now we're at RIBA stage 5, which is construction, which sounds as though it's fairly straightforward, but initially you will have a meeting where you get everybody around the table, the contractor and the client and the architect and the other key design disciplines, and you will discuss what are the rules for doing this job. Is there a client close by using part of the site? How are lorries coming and going? When do you want to be paid? Etc., etc. So you'll have a sort of sit-round meeting. You'll discuss methods of communication. Is it all going to be on some cloud, where you're all communicating via this cloud? Is it okay to email individuals, or do you have to email a company, etc.? You'll set all those rules so there can be no misunderstandings. Somebody then has to administer a building contract. Now, if that's a traditional building contract, then it would probably be the architect who's doing that. Sometimes you would use a project manager to do it, but very often it would be the architect. If it's design build, and you remember, the architect is now working for the contractor. So you have the client, you have the contractor, you have the architect down here working for the contractor. So obviously he can't administer the building contract because he's working for the contractor. So now you need a new person. And that new person is called an employer's agent. And we'll come on to that on another lecture. But somebody has to administer a building contract in a fair and reasonable manner, agree that monies can be paid each month, etc. Someone will be doing regular site inspections to monitor progress and quality, and dealing with any queries. There might be off-site manufacture. If you've got some fancy panels that are all going to get here, or it's all clad in ceramic material, then maybe you're going to have to visit things off-site and see how they're coming along. There will need to be regular evaluations, because the contractor can't just get paid at the end. They want paying as they go along, even on a little job, particularly on a little job actually. Contractors want paying. My daughter, I was with her yesterday in London, is doing a relatively modest extension to her house. The contractor, who's quite a small outfit, wants paying every week. So every week she has to sit down with him and make sure, yep, you've done that, yep, it's fair enough, we'll give you another 2,000 quid. And then finally, as an architect, you would be reporting to the client on a regular basis. So notwithstanding all your responsibilities to administer a building contract, you'd sit down with the client once a month and say, yep, it's going okay, or nope, we've got all sorts of problems and we've lost 2 weeks because we found a drain culvert and it collapsed and we had to blah, 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 blah. And you keep the client informed. Stage 6 is basically, here's the building, Mr. Client, there it is, are you happy? And the client says, thank you very much, that's great. It's a very important point contractually, it's a very important point financially, and it doesn't always go smoothly, as you can imagine, if the client is aggrieved about some element of quality, or it's late, or it's over budget. But it's a stage which we have to go through. We also have to make sure that it all adheres to the regulations, so all these fire exit signs are up, etc., etc., etc. And you need what's called as-built information. So you will have done your drawings, all the plans are there, but if things started changing for all sorts of reasons as the building started getting built, well then you have to update your drawings so that the client has a set of drawings which are exactly the same as the building that's being built. And finally, if you're doing sustainability criteria, there'll be a whole raft of key performance indicators that need to be tested to make sure that the building does indeed comply with that excellent rating and there's not sort of a big fudge going on. In use is an interesting stage. So lately, architects and clients have thought to themselves, we really should be learning from the mistakes we've made in the past. So what sometimes happens now is people undertake a post-occupancy review that takes place over the first 2 years of the building's life. And either the problems that occur are rectified, so if this room's very stuffy, they turn up the ventilation system, or if there are problems that really can't be rectified, well, we can learn from them so that we learn from them on the next project. And I have colleagues working for commercial practices who do this for their clients so that they make sure they don't make the same mistakes again. And sometimes it'll be the architect reminding the client not to make the same mistake. Yeah, so I've taught that. So it got revised in 2013 to take account of modern procurement methods. And as I said, design build projects, quite often the contractor gets taken on board at the end of RIB stage 3. That's when you've done your scheme design drawings, the sort of things you pin up in a design review. Sometimes it's at the end of stage 4. And in partnering with this university, quite often it's even earlier than that. With a traditional procurement, the architect is responsible for everything to do with RIB stage 4 and beyond. Okay, so that's the RIBA plan of work. I hope that's clear. It's the sort of second time we've been through it. We also went through it when we were talking about the LRC that we did, the very first lecture I gave. And let me just, before I move on, yes, that sign-off business, I keep harping on about it. After RIB stage 2, you literally get your drawings, you go and have a meeting with the client, and we literally get the client to sign on the top right-hand corner of the drawing saying, I'm happy with that design. At the end of RIB stage 3, your pin-up stage, we literally get the client, we literally get them to sign the drawings off. In that way, we get the client to be serious about, we're happy with your design, we realise you're now going to develop it in detail. And if they want to change their mind later, we ask them to pay us money to change the drawing. So this sign-off business is very important. It's a really important sanity check. And as you do that sign-off, although it's great for you to get the client to say, yes, I'm very happy with the design, the client will look you in the eyes and say, so can you still do it for 12 million? And you will have to say, yes. And the client will say, and can you still get it finished by September? And you will have to say, yes, or there's this problem or whatever. So it's both, it's signing off quality and budget and program. But it's very, very important in practice. That's what people do, and they produce little reports to do that. Okay, so building costings. Don't worry, there's not much more to come. No, we're all right on time. Sorry, I thought I was taking a long time. So for clients, you've heard that costs are really important. They agree a budget, they don't want to go over it. If they do go over it, people like Alex get a big kicking, and if you go over budget with a domestic client, they'll just say, we haven't got the money. The whole thing's dying to death. There was a project the problem with these things being taped, I have to be so careful. Before they got stream captured, I can tell you all sorts of stories. So I'll tell you, there is a local institution who did a project on a design-build basis 2 years ago, and they engaged their contractor quite early on, and the project value went up by 10%. And the Vice-Chancellor said, OK. Then it went up by another 5%. And, you know, we're talking a lot of money, because this is a £50 million job. And the Vice-Chancellor said no. The whole project was stopped. The contractor was got rid of. The architect lost the job. They have started the job again with a different architect and a different contractor. So that contractor pushing his luck, thinking, oh, the Vice-Chancellor won't mind 15% over, was wrong. Now, of course, it delayed the job by 6 months. It was a right pain in the neck. And the poor old architects, they were just doing what they were told, a big firm of architects. But so it's an example that sometimes money talks, and clients just can't always just find that extra bit of money. So there are two basic approaches to cost estimating. Cost per square metre and elemental. Cost per square metre is what it says it is. So if you've got a house, that's 100 square metres, and if it costs £2,000 a square metre, and that's £2 million. Simple as that. Cost per square metre. Now, there's all sorts of little rule books that tell you what rate is right for a shed, and what rate's right for a school, and what rate's right for a library, and you can kind of pull them off. The thing to watch, however, is that we've just done that for this house, and it's going to be £2 million. But what I forgot to tell you was it's right on the edge of a cliff, it's got a 2-mile road going to it, and we've got to put pile foundations. So the road's going to cost you 50 grand, the pile foundations are going to cost you 20 grand, and the fence to stop people falling off the cliff is 5,000. So all of that wasn't in the cost per square metre. Those are extra costs, and we need to bear them in mind. It also makes a difference where it is in the country. If it's in downtown Liverpool, it's one cost. If it's right in the Outer Hebrides, it's another cost, because it costs a load of money to get contractors out there. The second one is elemental costs. So this is where somebody takes your design and they get their glasses on and they say, ooh, there's 100 square metres of decking, and there's 20 square metres of brickwork, and there's 12 doors, and there's 16 windows, and they times them all by whatever each one of those things costs, and they come out at a grand figure. So it's a right pain in the neck, it's very detailed, takes a lot of time, but it's quite a precise way of seeing where the money is. So those are the two basic methods. So as you can see, cost per square metre is quick to do, gives you a really good rough estimate. You need to take account of the geographical area, ground conditions, and also preliminaries. So we very recently did, and some of you might have heard me do a talk on this, we did a boathouse down on the River Dee, and it was a pretty simple thing really, but it was going to cost a couple of million. And we got planning permission for it, but actually, because it was a tricky boathouse on a tricky site with nowhere for the contractor to put their setup, it was going to cost a load of money for the contractor to build loads of scaffolding and put their site setup and everything above it. Plus they'd have to have deliveries at really weird times of the day. Plus there are all sorts of issues to do with you mustn't contaminate the river, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, the long and short of it was the preliminary costs, that's to say the costs that the contractor incurred in building it, how hard it was to build, were really high. And so our estimate of cost went massively up because it was such a difficult site to deal with. And so cost per square metre tends to give a poor level of accuracy. You might think in terms of plus or minus 20%, if you're lucky. 20%, so that's a lot of money. Elemental, so you need to do a takeoff of the different elements. Even when you've done all this, and this very scholarly cost estimator has spent a whole week doing it, he still can get it wrong because the contractor can take a view on things, they can maybe buy cheap windows from somewhere, or they can roll things together and give it all to one contractor. And so still, you can have a level of accuracy plus or minus 10%, even with an elemental cost breakdown. So the truth of the matter is, the best way of checking the price of something is to ask a contractor, what's it going to cost to build? That's the bottom line. Doesn't matter, all of these early methods are all very well, but until you get those tenders back and Joe Bloggs says, I can build it for 2 million, you're not sure. And that is why this university, like involving the contractor, sooner rather than later, because if the contractor says they can do it for 12 million, they can do it. Not only that, you can hold them to that. You can tie them down to that contractually. So even early on, you can tie a contractor down to doing it for £12 million based on the sort of drawings you would pin up for your final design review. So this is very attractive to clients because it minimises the risk. Okay, last part of this presentation is to do with life cycle costings. Yep. So there's some stats for you, which may or may not be surprising. I don't know what other lectures you've had in these areas. The cost of maintaining and operating a building over 30 years is 5 times the initial construction cost. Okay? Now, why is that interesting? Well, it's interesting because if you're a very clever firm of architects, like Fielding Clegg, or some other firms who take their responsibility to delivering a building that does what it says on the tin seriously, then you can create a building that's very easy to use, low cost to maintain, and low cost to service in terms of electricity and water and all that sort of stuff. And so that 5 times the initial cost might come down considerably. And so fretting about the initial construction costs per se is obviously important. So it's important that Alex has got a figure in his mind for what the architecture school extension is going to cost. But actually, if he stood back and said, yeah, but what's it going to cost over 30 years? Because I've just employed this really clever architect who's using these products that have really long life and it hardly needs any heating. Well, in fact, it's carbon negative, so it's providing energy back to the grid. Well, actually, paying another £1 million isn't such a daft idea because I'm going to save 5 million over the next 30 years. So this is why it's important. It's why that clients who do joined-up thinking are beginning to clock that actually putting some thought into the longevity of a building and how well it performs is important. So then we've got the cost of operating a building over the lifetime can be 200 times the initial cost. So now, I'm talking now about, supposing it's, a big office building in the centre of London. I'm talking about all the costs associated with operating that building. So then the actual construction costs are very small in proportion to the whole operating costs of the organisation. And if you were making cars, if you're Toyota, it's the same thing, where the cost of the actual building is quite small in proportion to the overall operating costs. So yet again, if you can get it right, if you can have asked the right questions working for Toyota so that the flow of materials, staff and cars is right, then you're going to save them a shed load of money, and the fact that it costs them another 5 million maybe doesn't matter. So this is where we need to put in context. So now the professional fees associated with an average project are maybe 10 or 15% of the construction costs. So now it won't have escaped many of you to think, if you are operating or offering a really clever service where you're on top of the latest green technologies, where you've researched the most incredibly low maintenance products, where you ask 1 million questions so that you're ensuring operationally the building works really well, well, it's going to take the office more time. You're going to have people working on it longer. You're going to ask more. You're going to go to more meetings, etc., etc., etc. So inevitably, unless you're going to ask people to work for free, your fee is slightly higher. But even so, your fee is very low in comparison to A, the construction costs, and then even lower in terms of the maintenance and operating costs. So that in any sane world, clients will be employing the cleverest architects so that their overall costs were reduced. Now, of course, architects, our clients have their own views on this. The University of Liverpool do take a lot of these things seriously, and they have a 30-70 split. So when they're choosing an architect, they have a big matrix, one of those ridiculous tick box things, which is very difficult to do. But when all the ticks are added up, the ticks to do with quality are 70% of why the architect would be appointed. The ticks to do with how much the architect is wanting to charge are 30% of the decision to take the architect on. So you can see this university believes that somebody who delivers a good service is really, really important. Okay, they can't just charge ridiculous fees, but they certainly are prepared to take a view on fees if they really like what that architect has got to offer. Design times for creating an energy efficient and low maintenance building can be highly cost effective is sort of obvious, isn't it? So, summary. Remember, if you get stuck, time, cost, quality, the magic triangle is the secret to many things. Procurement affects how the design process is managed. We'll come on to that further on in other lectures, but you can imagine once the contractor is in the driving seat, the design process is really very different from if the architect is taking it right the way through. The RIBA work stages can be a really useful discipline. If you can get the client to sign off at the end of each work stage, then it avoids that ridiculous thing where you come to almost going out to tender and the client's saying, well, I always wanted the master bedroom to have a bay window and a fitted wardrobe, And you say, whoa, just a minute now, you signed off this drawing and we chatted about it and you said that was just fine. If you want us to change it now, blah, blah. Otherwise, trust me, it's you using your weekend to redraw those drawings at your expense, because the client will go, well, that's what I want, get on and do it. And you've got nowhere to hide unless you've done that sign-off. Early cost estimates can be plus or minus 20%, which is well worth remembering if you're advising anybody. And the cost of a building over 30 years is high relative to the architect's fees. So anything you can do to contribute to that is good. So that's your reading. Don't forget to put your names against the topics on your way out. Anybody who's confused or concerned can come and see me. And next week it's architects and the construction process, our place in the... So thank you very much.